Thank everyone for coming, for joining us. I see some friends here, Agnieszka, Itamar, Theodore, nice to see you. Yeah, and as you said, this is the first webinar after our fourth World Congress that took place in Sinai last month. It was very nice, and this is also a special session of our Logic and Religion webinar, because for the first time we are going to deal with an Afro-Brazilian tradition named Candomblé. So our speaker today will be José Eduardo Porcher. He's currently studying those traditions from the perspective of analytic philosophy. So we're very excited to hear about what those underrepresented religions, in fact, what they have to tell us about all the problems that we contemporary philosophers deal with. So before giving the room to Porcher, I'm gonna say some few words about him. So José Eduardo Porcher, he's a philosopher working on the philosophies of religion and psychiatry. He's the leader of the project Expanding the Philosophy of Religion by Engaging with Afro-Brazilian Traditions, which is funded by John Templeton Foundation. And he's also a member of a project entitled How Emotions Inform Religion, integrating Christian theology and cognitive affective neuroscience. He's currently a research fellow at the Pontifical Catholic University of Rio de Janeiro. He was previously a research fellow at the Federal University of Santa Maria in Brazil, Rutgers Center for the Philosophy of Religion, the Jesuit School of Philosophy and Theology, and the Federal University of Paraná here in Brazil. He has also been a visiting fellow at the Leeds Center for Philosophy of Religion and at the Birmingham Center for Philosophy of Religion. So I forgot to say the title of his talk is Why Doesn't Candomblé, this is specific Afro-Brazilian religious tradition, why doesn't Candomblé have a problem of evil? So the idea is that Porcher is going to speak for about 40 minutes, a bit more, perhaps, and then we open for questions. So Porcher, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Francisco de Assis Mariano and Ricardo Silvestre, for inviting me to speak at your wonderful webinar. This is a great initiative. I'm pleased to be a part of it. And I apologize in advance if there's any background noise, because there's renovations going on in my apartment building, hopefully not too loud. And before I start, I will try to share my screen with you. I'll have some slides. There you go. Not if you can see them. Okay, good. So this is the title of my presentation, which Ricardo already told you. Why doesn't Candomblé have a problem of evil? And because I have about 30-40 minutes, I cannot go into a long introduction about this family of traditions. I usually do, and I usually go way too long on my introduction. So hopefully I can clear some doubts in the Q&A session afterwards, but I'll just jump right in. And let me see if I can move my slides. Yes, okay. So I was recently in the final conference of the Global Philosophy of Religion project led by Yuji Nagasawa, and it was hosted at Waseda University in Tokyo, and the theme of the conference was the problem of evil and suffering. The idea was to discuss various versions of and perspectives on the problem, and I was tasked with presenting it from the perspective of Candomblé, an Afro-diasporic religion that developed in Brazil, usually from Yoruba, but also Angola, that is Bantu sources. And I talked about this at Waseda University in April for the first time, and then at the University of Birmingham in June, and last month in Brasilia So what follows is very much work in progress and the raw material for a paper I'm writing for a special issue that I'm organizing on Afro-Brazilian religions to be published soon in the journal Religious Studies. Well, my first response was thinking that there is no problem of evil in Candomblé. This was not the result of much reflection, but just an observation. All I have ever read, heard, and seen about Candomblé never touches upon that problem in whatever version, as far as I can tell. So the question I propose to investigate, and which I think is valid and hopefully enlightening, was why not? Why doesn't Candomblé have a problem of evil? And even if Candomblé doesn't grapple with the problem of evil, should it? So that raised the question, how should I go about this task? And what sources should I rely on? Where should I pry and answer from? I found out that some philosophers and Africanists had been discussing issues surrounding the problem of evil in Yoruba thought for a couple of decades. These African, mostly Nigerian and Ghanaian philosophers have been doing something that I have very rarely seen happen in Brazil. They are doing philosophy and theology from indigenous, autochthonous sources. So in that respect, I commend them. But they have been doing so in a manner that struck me as very literal-minded. Most of their arguments rely on what seemed to me to be very personal readings of Yoruba mythic narratives. Of course, I had had contact with Yoruba and Yoruba-diasporic mythology before while studying up on Afro-Brazilian religions. Reginaldo Prandi's monumental Mitologia dos Orixás quickly became one of my go-to sources. But before trying to answer the question I was posed, I had not thought of using these sources to try to extract a philosophical and theological position on an issue. These myths belong to an oral, literary tradition, and have only begun to be compiled in recent decades. If you're familiar with African and Afro-diasporic mythology, you are aware that these myths often give different versions of the same story, which are not always consistent, as we will see in a minute. And this usually poses no problem at all, unless you are a scholar trying to give the last word on a certain issue and end up cherry-picking your way through this literature. The issue at hand, the question that matters most, I think, for us to glean an answer to the question of why Candomblé doesn't have a problem of evil is, what kind of God is Olodumare, also known as Olorum in Candomblé, that is the supreme being of Candomblé, at least in its Nago or Yoruba nation. In the absence of systematic theology or agreed upon codified sacred texts, mythic narratives may just give us a fighting chance. As Mikhail Burley has noted, 20 years after Kevin Schulbrecht lamented the fact that studying myths from a philosophical perspective was then nearly non-existent, although the philosophy of religion would seem to be a natural home for reflection on myths, this has not been the case. For our purposes, however, I don't think we even have a choice. We need to rely on myths. The question then is whether, as Burley affirms, mythic narratives embody visions of the world that may be rightly termed philosophical, and how philosophy of religion may be expanded by giving them sustained and careful attention. So in this talk, I would like to do two things. First, to look at myths and try to pry from them a reasonably uncontroversial set of attributes of Olorum or Olodumare, and see if this answers our question regarding the problem of evil. And second, by so doing, to call attention to how myths can enrich and be instrumental to the philosophy of religion, especially in contexts in which other sources are sparse. And finally, I'd like to take this opportunity to exemplify that we can shed light on neglected traditions by trying to figure out why these problems are not raised within them. rather than trying to make a tradition fit the classical problems formulated by an overwhelmingly theistic and more specifically Christian philosophy of religion. So the so-called problem of evil is, as you well know, one of the most discussed families of arguments in the philosophy of religion. They are usually formulated in two versions, one termed logical and another termed evidential. And because they are probably the strongest argument against theism, they are frequently marshaled by atheists, and providing solutions to their challenges is a favorite pastime of theist thinkers. Michael Hickson provides a nice summary of the general structure of the problem, as it is understood by contemporary philosophers at least. He says, today the problem of evil basically argues, if there is a God, then he must possess attributes X, Y, Z. But evil shows that the first cause of the universe positively cannot, or probably does not, possess attributes X, Y, or Z. Therefore, there is probably not a God. Evil calls God's existence into question only if God's nature can be pinned down. He must possess attributes X, Y, Z. Hickson's summary directs our attention to the fact that contemporary arguments from evil are specifically aimed at undermining modern proponents of Anselmian perfect being theology, the core of which is the omni-God thesis. The idea that God just is an omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent being. The logical problem of evil is the appearance of inconsistency between the existence of God and the existence of any evil at all. A defense against the logical problem of evil is then an argument that purports to show that this appearance is misleading and, in fact, there is no such inconsistency. To my mind, the most intuitive and powerful version of the problem of evil is the evidential problem of evil, and I will favor this formulation here. Differently from the logical problem of evil, it usually focuses on the inconsistency of maximal person properties and gratuitous, horrendous evil, not just any evil. Think, for example, of a child born with serious birth defects. William Rowe originally formulated the argument as follows. There exist instances of intense suffering which an omnipotent, omniscient being could have prevented without thereby losing some greater good or permitting some evil equally bad or worse. An omniscient, wholly good being would prevent the occurrence of any intense suffering it could, unless it could not do so without thereby losing some greater good or permitting some evil equally bad or worse. Therefore, there does not exist an omnipotent, omniscient, wholly good being. So the argument assumes that if God exists, God possesses the omni-God attributes. It then looks at the world to see if there is anything about our experience that might cause us to conclude that an omni-God does not exist. According to Rowe, there is the fact of intense, gratuitous human and animal suffering. Given this fact, Rowe believes it is highly improbable that an omni-God exists and that we have reasonable grounds for embracing atheism, where atheism means the rejection of classical personalist theism. Now let's turn to Candomblé. Candomblé, as some of you know, is not a monolith. It is rather a family of traditions spread throughout Brazil. Because Candomblé Ketu, or Nago, that is the tradition that sprung mostly from Yoruba sources, mixed in with other nations, as well as Spiritist, Catholic, and Amerindian influences, has been the focus of most studies by anthropologists, ethnologists, sociologists, and so on. I will focus on the mythology of the Nago, as it appears in many anthropological compilations, such as Prandi's Mitologia dos Orixás, but also in Pierre Véger, Joana Elbain dos Santos, Monique Augrat, and José Benisti. To equate Olodumare, the creator god of Candomblé, with God, capital G, by which we usually think of the Abrahamic God, most definitely an omni-God, and the God that atheist philosophers think is improbable on the face of gratuitous evil, is far from uncontroversial. Again, there is not much discussion among scholars about this topic on this side of the Atlantic, but we only have to leaf through African philosophy journals and books to find debates about the nature of Olodumare going back to the 1960s. So before I delve into the myths pertaining to the Nago nation of Candomblé, I'd like to look briefly at what philosophers working on African traditional religion, more specifically on Yoruba religion, have said about the attributes of Olodumare, so we have something with which to compare what we will conclude from the myths themselves. The first wave of Africanists was comprised of scholars who went from their home countries in Africa to Europe to study and were appalled by Western interpretations of African traditional religion. On top of their very understandable reactive attitude, these scholars were mostly Christian themselves, and they had an agenda. They wanted to argue that African traditional religion was a religion and not mere fetishism, and that they deserved the same respect as the great world religions. Running across their writings is the idea that African traditional religion was monotheistic. In so doing, scholars such as the Nigerian Methodist pastor Bolaji Idowu and the Kenyan Anglican priest John Beatty defended that the supreme being of ATR is God with capital G. They propose that Olodumare is supreme, transcendent, the creator of all things, omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent. In their laudable and understandable fervor, however, they might have overcorrected. This is certainly how they strike me, and it seems like a consensus among contemporary Africanists. Later authors have accused Idowu and Beatty of adhering to a colonial mentality and trying to dress Olodumare in theistic garb, so to speak. Drawing mostly on mythic narratives and their own experience, Nigerian philosophers John Bewaji and Ademola Fayemi, for instance, state that Olodumare is rather supreme, but not transcendent, co-creator, but not omnipotent, not omniscient, and not omnibenevolent. Finally, as a curiosity, I found one scholar that thinks that even the toned-down version of Olodumare that Bewaji and Fayemi put forth is exaggerated, drawing on what can seem a rather idiosyncratic reading of creation myths in the Yoruba tradition. Segun Badejeshin states that Olodumare is not even supreme. According to him, Olodumare is kind of like the Bishop of Rome before the schism, the first among equals. Olodumare inhabits the same plane of existence as Obatala, Orunmila, and Eshu, the triad of high gods in Yoruba religion, followed by a lower spiritual plane inhabited by the rest of the Orishas, the deities, such as Oshun, Ogun, Yemanja, and so on, and then another lower spiritual plane inhabited by the ancestors, and finally, the physical world. While there are no myths concerning Olodumare specifically, Olodumare does appear in several creation myths, the genetic myths, those dealing with the emergence of existence and the creation of the earthly realm. In A History of the Yoruba People, the Nigerian historian Adebanji Akintoye says, the realm of the spirits was conceived as consisting of two spheres, a higher and a lower. The higher was the place of the supreme Olodumare, who created all things and ruled over all of existence. The supreme being's sphere was so far above the human's world that humans could not worship or relate directly with him. Therefore, only in a very few places in Yoruba land did shrines emerge for his worship. Generally, people believed that no human could know what sacrifices would be acceptable to Olorum also known as Olodumare. The second heavenly sphere existed in very close proximity to the world of humans and was the home of all the other gods and the spirits, all arranged in grades from the highest to the lowest. The highest category consisted of the Orishas, namely Orishanla, the arch divinity, Ifa, the god of wisdom and divination, Ogun, the god of working people and of iron, and Eshu, messenger of the senior gods, and others. So according to Akintoye, and I think his description here is as uncontroversial as it gets, Olodumare is the supreme being and a distant, outlying god. This fits well with Nago mythology and practice. In Brazil, there are absolutely no shrines or sacrifices to Olodumare. You could go to a worship place, a terreiro, for a long time before you even ever hear of Olodumare, unless you inquire specifically about the creation myths and ask questions like, who created the world, who created the Orishas, and where does the spiritual energy known as Ashe come from? As a curiosity for the past 2 or 3 years, I have been compiling songs about and inspired by Afro-Brazilian mythology on Spotify, coming up on the hundreds now. And the only ones I know that talk specifically about the supreme deity are Olorum by the great Mateus Aleluia, former member of Os Cinco Anos, and Olorum by Sergio Santos. Both their lyrics evince Olorum's distant character. The first one repeats, Olorum, leave your kingdom and come see me. Olorum, your people are tired of suffering. And the second one laments, why does the people of Olorum suffer so much? When I ask Zambi, there is no echo at all. There's an example of syncretism here, because Olorum is how the Yoruba call the supreme being, and Zambi is how the Bantu peoples, the Angola nation of Candomblé, talk about their supreme being. Joana Elbain dos Santos, in her magnificent Os Nagô e a Morte, the Nagô and Death, provides us with the only narrative I've found so far about what happened even before the generation of the Orishas, and the separation between the spiritual and the earthly worlds. She recounts, in the beginning, there was nothing but air. Olorum was an infinite mass of air. When it began to move slowly, to breathe, part of the air turned into a mass of water, originating the great Orisha Funfun, Orisha of white, that is, Oxalá or Obatala, the arch divinity and an Orisha that we'll talk about in the next few minutes. The air and water moved together and apart of themselves turned into mud. From this mud, a bubble or mound emerged, the first matter to be given shape, a reddish and muddy rock. Olorum admired this shape and blew on the mound, breathing his breath and giving it life. This form, the first endowed with individual existence, a laterite rock, was Eshu, or rather the proto-Eshu, Eshu Yangi. When Olorum Olodumare decided to create the earthly world, called Aye, he called on the great Orisha, literally Orishanla, usually contracted to Oxalá, which is another name for Obatala. I know this is confusing, and I'll try to help you as I go along. This begins what is probably the most widespread narrative of creation in Candomblé mythology. There are various versions of this myth in the literature, but Prenji does a great job of trying to capture its essence, having closely examined all extant sources he could find. Here is his version. I color-coded the names of the deities so you can know when the same one is being referred to by a different name, which is very common. In a time when the world was only Olodumare's imagination, there was only the infinite firmament, and beneath it, the vastness of the sea. Olorum, the Lord of Heaven, and Olokun, the mistress of the oceans, were of the same age and shared the secrets of what was and would be. Olorum and Olokun had 2 children, Orishala, the firstborn, also called Obatala, and Odudua, the youngest. Olorum Olodumare entrusted Obatala, the lord of the white cloth, with the creation of the world. Olorum bestowed powers upon him for this purpose. Obatala sought the counsel of Orunmila, who advised him to make offerings to succeed in this mission. But Obatala did not take Orunmila's prescriptions seriously, as he believed solely in his own powers. Odudua observed everything attentively, and on that day, he also consulted Orunmila. Orunmila assured Odudua that if he made the prescribed sacrifices, he would become the ruler of the world that was to be created. The offering consisted of 400,000 chains, a chicken with 5-toed feet, a pigeon, and a chameleon, along with 400,000 cowries. Odudua made the offerings. On the day of the creation of the world, Obatala set out on a journey to the border of the beyond, where Eshu is the guardian. Obatala did not make the offerings in that place, as prescribed. Thus, a great thirst began to torment Obatala. Obatala approached a palm tree and touched its trunk with his long staff. Wine gushed abundantly from the palm tree, and Obatala drank from the wine until he became intoxicated. He became completely drunk and fell asleep on the road under the shade of the palm tree. No one would dare to awaken Obatala. Odudua watched everything. When he was certain that Oshala was asleep, Odudua picked up the sack of creation that had been given to Obatala by Olorum. Odudua went to Olodumare and told him what had happened. Olodumare saw the sack of creation in Odudua's possession and entrusted him with the task of creating the world. Then Odudua took the chameleon and made it walk on that surface, demonstrating the firmness of the place. Obatala was still asleep. Odudua set out for the earth to claim it as his own. Then Obatala woke up and learned of what had transpired. He returned to Olodumare and recounted his story. Olodumare said, "The world has already been created. You missed a great opportunity." To punish him, Olodumare forbade Obatala from drinking palm wine forever, him and all his descendants. But the mission was not yet complete, and Olodumare bestowed another gift upon Obatala, the creation of all living beings that would inhabit the earth. And so Obatala created all living beings, and he created man and woman. Obatala molded the human beings from clay, and the breath of Olodumare brought them to life. The world was now complete, and all praised Obatala. The alternative version of the myth of Oshala and the creation of the earthly world, also compiled in Parenji's anthology, omits the participation of Odudua. Joana Elbain dos Santos, who among others characterizes Odudua as female, says that the fight for the supremacy between the sexes is a constant factor in all Nago myths. Importantly, this is a reminder that the myths are not univocal and that literal-mindedness is not the attitude we should take towards them. The alternative version has Oshala actually succeeding in creating the world. In it, he does not ignore Orunmila's advice, so it is less of a cautionary tale regarding the importance of offering and sacrifice, as well as never forgetting to appease Eshu before you set out to do something. However, the alternative version also features Oshala becoming inebriated with palm wine. However, the consequence this time is not that Oshala misses the opportunity to become the Lord of creation. Here's an excerpt of the version compiled by José Benisci. With all the elements in his power, Obatala completed the task, equipping the earth with woods, rivers, and waterfalls. Soon after, he was assigned another job, that of modeling the physical image of those who were to inhabit the entire created earth. To do this, he turned the clay over and moistened it with water from the springs, modeling in the form determined by Olodumare figures identical to human beings. Obatala worked tirelessly, becoming exhausted and very thirsty. He sought to help himself with palm wine, emu. Therefore, he went to look for liquid among the other palm trees to alleviate his thirst. Upon extracting the liquid, he let it ferment and then drank it for a long time until he felt his body soften and everything around him spin. When he managed to stand up, he returned to work, but without his initial conditions. As a result, several models of the figures became clumsy, misshapen, with crooked legs and arms. Others had a high back, disproportionate head, and irregular height, identical to dwarfs. Even so, everyone was placed in an appropriate position, awaiting the presence of the Supreme Being to give life to all of the inanimate figures. The instruction given to Obatala, therefore, was that when he had completed his part in the creation of man, he would notify Olodumare, who would then come to give life, placing the emi, breath, in their bodies, thus completing the creation of the human being. From mere molded clay figures, they transformed into beings of blood, nerves, and flesh. With life breathed into their nostrils, they began to walk and do the things necessary for their survival. Finally, when the effect of the palm wine ceased, Obatala saw that some humans he had modeled were deformed. He was sad and felt remorse. Then he said, "I will never drink palm wine again. I will always be the protector of all humans who are defective or who are created imperfect." Because of this promise, human beings who are lame, blind, armless, deaf, mute, and those who have no pigment in their skin, albinos, are called Eni Orisha, special people under his protection. Given the picture of Olodumare we get from these narratives, it seems fair to say that view 1, which states that Olodumare is an omnigod like the god of classical theism, is difficult to reconcile with the mythology of Candomblé, since it is precisely the existence of an omnigod which is being attacked with arguments from evil. The falsity of view 1 explains why it is that Candomblé does not have a problem of evil. Succinctly said, Candomblé does not embrace what some call theistic personalism and others call perfect being theology. In sum, Olodumare is not an omnigod. Nowhere in these myths do we get even a hint that Olodumare is an omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent being. We can safely assume that Olodumare is the supreme being, which then rules out the outlandish view 3, which equates Olodumare with, for example, Oxalá Obatala and Orunmila. Olodumare is the source of all life and power, and Obatala, Orunmila, and the other Orishas either emerge from Olodumare or are created by Olodumare, and as we have seen, it is the Orishas who actually create the earthly world and all beings that live in it. As the source of life and power, one may say that Olodumare is the most powerful being, but again, we see no indication of omnipotence. For instance, Olodumare does not seem to have absolute authority over the Orishas. Regarding omniscience, the creation myths you have heard do not touch directly upon this, but note that whenever someone seeks knowledge, like Oxalá before setting out to create the world, they go to Orunmila, also called Ifa, the deity of divination and wisdom, and not to Olodumare. And some Yoruba myths actually feature Olodumare himself consulting Orunmila. Again, regarding omnibenevolence, Nago mythology does not posit Olodumare's moral perfection. Olodumare could be the most morally superior being, although I have not seen any evidence of that in the mythic narratives either. Nowhere in the extant sources for Candomblé's mythic narratives is Olodumare described as all good. Furthermore, one can argue that the responsibility for the fact that the Orishas do evil can ultimately be tracked back to him, which would make Olodumare morally ambivalent at best. In that respect, recall the example I gave of gratuitous horrendous evil, that is, children born with birth defects. Olodumare delegates to Oxalá the creation of human beings, who then manages to drink on the job and make a mess of it. Instead of correcting Oxalá's mistakes or urging Oxalá to try again, Olodumare proceeds to breathe life into these forms. Paraphrasing the evidential argument from evil, if Olodumare could do otherwise and was wholly good, then he should have or would have, but he didn't. So barring non-existence for the sake of the argument, either Olodumare is not all-powerful, or Olodumare is not all good, or most likely taking the myths into serious consideration, Olodumare is neither all-powerful nor all good. He does not prevent gratuitous evil, nor intervene to correct it. Either way, this is not an active discussion in Candomblé circles or literature, which I also take as evidence that the problem simply does not fit the worldview embodied by Nago mythology, since the alternative would be to say that no one in such circles has ever noticed the problem, which I think is far less plausible. On the other hand, José Benicia's version of the myth has Oxalá deeply remorseful, and in a poignant moment in the narrative, Oxalá promises to atone for the evil he has done, vowing to be the protector of those who suffer because of his negligence. So while the problem of evil is not really a problem for these traditions, the existence of evil is not swept under the rug or denied in any way. Of course, we shouldn't interpret these as scientific hypotheses regarding the universe's origin, but rather as poetic representations. They serve as a means to convey a profound philosophical idea that the world holds a profound duality encompassing both destructive and constructive elements that are often challenging to distinguish. On one hand, the genetic myths of Candomblé can be seen as encapsulating the deeply rooted moral ambivalence of Olodumare, the Orishas, and the world. And on the other hand, they serve as a linguistic tool for expressing values, beliefs, and commitments that history alone cannot fully elucidate. Well, I hope that in the time available to me, I have made it clear that we stand to gain a lot from giving serious and sustained attention to myths in the philosophy of religion, especially when dealing with traditions in which mythology remains the main form of communicating their commitments. In such cases, again, I believe ignoring mythic narratives is simply not a choice. Although this is all new to me, since I have started to think about these issues in the last 2.5 years, I am excited about what further exploration and methodological expansion may hold. And I hope you share some of my excitement. Thank you for listening and for inviting me to share some of my thoughts with you.
Thank you very much, Eduardo. Thank you so much. It was a very, very interesting talk. I enjoyed it a lot. So now we have time for questions. If any one of you wants to ask something, just raise your virtual hand. Okay, Julio, go ahead.
As you mentioned, in any, at least in Brazil, no Candomblé terreiro has a shrine to Olodumare. Only the orishas, only the other orishas receive sacrifice, demand obligations of the devotees, etc., etc. So it seems to me that the question, how do I understand whatever it is in Candomblé by knowing the attributes of Olumare, seems to be to trying to fit a round pin into a square whole. It's completely out of place. The answer to these questions seems to be to be found naturally in the rich and complex dynamics of the interactions between the many orishas and the role of the devotees in these dynamics. We will not learn from Candomblé by mimicking monotheistic religions. That seems to be the case here.
I agree, and I hope that in my talk I have made it clear that I fully agree with you, Julio, and that the problem does not fit the problem of evil, and most philosophical problems in the philosophy of religion don't fit this tradition. The fact is that I didn't see anywhere people trying to explain why they don't fit. So this is the first steps towards an explanation of why they don't fit. And I think as soon as we look to the myths, and of course we can look to the practice as well, and that's very important because rituals are very neglected in philosophy of religion as well. But yeah, they don't fit. Olodumare, to be a monotheistic omnigod, you need to engage in the kind of normative theological exercise that is completely unconstrained by the myths and by the practice of the religion. And this has been done, of course, as a reactive attitude, as I said, by some of the African scholars that were Christians themselves on the one hand, and on the other, they had this agenda of trying to disabuse the Europeans and Westerners as a whole of the notion that ATR, African traditional religion, was not even a religion. It was just faith fetishism. We have some more people. I think Evan Fales was raising his actual hand before some of the people who raised their virtual hands.
Yeah,
I don't have any virtual hand, or if I do, I don't know where it is. I found this extraordinarily interesting talk. And one of the things that I was provoked into thinking about by it involves doing a kind of an inversion here. Of course, the creation story within the Judeo-Christian tradition is given in Genesis. And I have long puzzled over the question whether, in particular, the Torah, the Pentateuch, the first 5 books, ever characterize Yahweh in this omni tradition. I cannot find any texts that clearly make that claim. It is true that the attributes that are given to Yahweh make him creator, they make him supreme, they make him very powerful, certainly. But you don't, as far as I can tell, and I can't read Hebrew, but as far as I can tell, there's very little there that would suggest that Yahweh in that early tradition is explicitly thought of as the omni-God. There are, as I'm sure you're well aware, some very intriguing parallels between the Genesis story and the Candomblé story. Number one, there are various places in the what we call the Old Testament where God regrets what he's done. He says, "Oh, I screwed up." There is for the tradition, the modern tradition surrounding Yahweh, a thorny problem to which I've never seen a really plausible answer. It says that God made Adam and Eve, and he saw that what he was done was good. Why did they screw up? And this, in a way, parallels the Candomblé myth. And it's really a devil of a problem to explain why Adam and Eve made the blunder that they made. It's also true, but occurs later in
I'm really sorry, Ivan, to interrupt you, but I have limited time. So
Okay.
if you could ask your question, I appreciate
So
it.
can I say a few words in response to Often Fails?
Yeah, you should.
So I'm not a scholar of Jewish theology, but I fully agree with you that if we look to Genesis and the rest of the books in the Torah with a literal mind, we will have a lot of difficulty trying to make sense of how we go from this God to the God of the theologians. And what John Beatty and Bolaji Idowu may say, may have said, in their defense, we're doing theology, normative theology. These myths are not to be taken literally, but to make sense of this picture of God, we need to attribute to God these X, Y, Z attributes. So that's a normative and not a descriptive exercise. And it's much the same in the case of Judaism, I guess. You could say to try to pry some kind of difference between Yahweh and Olodumare, I would say that transcendence is something that comes much more easily to Yahweh than to Olodumare, because Olodumare, as the myths in the Nagô tradition of Candomblé tell us, Olodumare was there as a mass of air, and so there are pre-existing materials. There are materials that exist at least as long as Olodumare exists, and so it's very, very hard, very forceful to say that Olodumare is transcendent. Apparently, the spiritual world where Olodumare and then the other deities exist, it has existed since eternity, which is not necessarily the case for Yahweh. But yeah, again, I'm not a Jewish scholar, and I appreciate the comparison, because I think it's very useful to think about what kind of exercise is being done, either a descriptive or a normative one. Thank you.
Thank you. Adam, please ask your question.
Great. Thank you so much for the talk. This is super clear and very interesting. I guess I have a kind of methodological question that might tie in Julia's question and also maybe some of Evan's points. So I think we said at the start that kind of one of the points of this exercise of thinking about the problem of evil in Candomblé was to kind of, I think you put it as, we shed light on neglected traditions by trying to figure out why these problems are not raised within them, rather than trying to make a tradition fit the classical problems formulated by an overwhelmingly or specifically Christian theistic philosophy of religion. And so I like this idea of trying to break free of this kind of Christian paradigm of philosophy of religion. But I wonder if maybe we've kind of ended up still in that trap, still in that paradigm, in maybe two ways. So the first of these is just we're starting with the problem of evil rather than starting with the religious tradition itself. And so we're already entering with this kind of Christian way of thinking about this religion.
Can I
of course, maybe we're doing this stuff.
Before you say more, I completely agree. So much so that I did this talk because I was invited to talk about the problem of evil in these traditions. But when I sat down to write the paper, eventually I found myself thinking exactly what you're thinking, which is I shouldn't start with the problem of evil. This should be an afterthought. I should talk about the myths and about the nature of Olodumare from these myths, and then say, by the way, the problem of evil doesn't get off the ground. So I fully agree with you there.
Okay, great.
Second
I'm glad to
question?
hear that. Yeah, and I see kind of pragmatic reasons for starting with the problem of evil. As you said, like this is a, you're at the conference, here's the way to get people to be thinking about these other traditions. But the second issue, I think, and maybe is more centered on your methodology of focusing so much on the myths. So I might worry that maybe this is kind of too textual of a focus, and that maybe this is an inheritance from a kind of Protestant approach to religion, where what we do is we really look at the texts rather than looking at the practices or how these texts are understood. And so I wonder if you have any comments about this. A lot of your analysis seemed to be, look, here's these myths that anthropologists have gone out and recorded, presumably through oral histories and things like that. But I didn't really get a sense that we had a lot of kind of on-the-ground views of the practitioners kind of maybe interpreting these myths. I don't know if that's the right way to put it. You had these two songs, sorry, from Spotify that I thought that was a really interesting kind of way to get at more on-the-ground views. Yeah, I wonder if, again, by just focusing so much on myth, we're again falling into this kind of Christian Protestant trap of this is what religion is.
I think we think a lot alike, Adam, because again, I fully agree with you. What you're seeing here is a small section of the project of my work on Afro-Brazilian religions. And eventually, while thinking, how can I do philosophy of religion from these traditions that are non-institutional, non-textual, which focus on ritual and not belief, which are overwhelmingly embodied. How can I do philosophy from this? And well, I found two answers. One is ethnography, and the other is the myths, which are an oral literary tradition. The myths are kind of an afterthought. I've been focused much more on ethnography, on practice, on ritual, but while trying to explain to people why this tradition doesn't have a problem of evil, the myths are even an even better source, I think. So I think we don't need to of course say religion is textual, and I fully agree with the Protestant bias towards that in the study of religion in general, which fortunately has been on the decline, I'd say, at least among religious studies scholars, not so much between philosophers of religion. But I think I fully agree with you there. But at the same time, no one had looked at these myths to try to pry any kind of philosophical position. So while I will not delve into myths single-handedly, I think there is some merit to at least using some of these myths to try to understand the worldview and the philosophical underpinnings of this worldview in the case of Candomblé, at least.
Great.
Thank
wonderful.
you.
Thank you. Bill, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much for your talk. I've been much interested in mythology for quite some time now. So I want to make some comments. First of all, I think what we need to, it's not so much a Christian or Protestant issue. That's not the issue as I see it. It's essentially has to do with, it's a theological versus a mythological, if you can use that, distinction. And so in the theological perspective, we tend to reduce God or these stories to essentialist notions. And the whole problem of evil only arises, at least as we understand it, you described it, in this essentialist context. So, but from a mythological perspective, the problem of evil also arises. It just doesn't arise in the same way, nor is it dealt with in the same way. Because mythologies are telling with stories. They of people, of gods who are very much like humans, and and as you emphasize, not, and also supreme and unknowable and ununderstandable. But the point I'm trying to get at is this: we need to make clear this distinction between a mythological, story-based understanding of God and the supreme beings and the relationship with human beings, and those that are theological. And so, for example, you mentioned that we shouldn't take the myths figuratively, I mean literally, but maybe figuratively. I think that's the wrong distinction. There shouldn't be that mythological religions, mythological relationships, as Eliade speaks of it, is not to be viewed that way. It's in a different context, a different understanding of a relationship with the gods, if you like. And in particular, it would be interesting to see how these myths develop, because there are kinds of conversations with human experience. And so this is what makes the mythological response to these problems is very different than a theological approach. I don't know. Anyway, that's sort of I hope that's a question there somewhere.
Yeah, I don't hear a question in there somewhere, but I do appreciate the comments, and I do agree that there is some kind of mythological problem of evil, as you said. There is, of course, the traditional formal version of the problem of evil that I alluded to, like Hickson's versions and Rowe's version of the problem of evil. But of course, if you look to, for example, African philosophers who have been dealing with the problem of evil in African traditional religion in the last 25 years, I think, they do talk about a problem of evil, because even though most scholars would say, well, Olodumare is not an omnigod, still, he is the supreme being, and still, there is evil in the world, and even more than that, there is evil that seems to be a direct consequence of Olodumare's action or inaction. So there's still some kind of problem there. And what I've seen, at least recently, is that the moral ambivalence of Olodumare, the fact that Olodumare may himself be able to commit evil, is an integral part of the worldview here, and not something to be explained away. It's part and parcel of the worldview. The fact that God does evil is not it's not a theoretical problem like the problem of evil is for philosophers, but it is something that is, as you said, maybe a mythological problem of evil. And still, I think it merits saying that the problem doesn't just disappear if we don't stick to the philosophical formulation. So I think I agree with you there. And Francisco?
Okay, thanks so much. Francisco allowed me to ask a question before him. Thank you so much, Francisco. So I myself have a question. Perhaps one comment and then a question. And this point was raised by some people who asked questions here. Is the idea that you are dealing with a tradition which is an oral tradition, as you said, emphasizes a lot of rituals, and then you need somehow to interpret this tradition, or I might use the word, you have to reconstruct the tradition somehow, or to describe it using some categories, and of course some philosophical categories. And I was thinking of two key categories that you use. The first one, the word God, and the second one, the word supreme, right? So the fact that all you are talking about is relevant, it seems to me, it has to do with the fact that you are saying that it seems to me that you are characterizing Candomblé as a monotheistic tradition, right? There's a God with capital G, or at least a God with small g, which is supreme. Then use the word supreme, but I understood it that way. So I was wondering what grounds there are for claiming that Olodumare is supreme, because he doesn't have those omni attributes, right? And many times when philosophers think of the concept of supreme, they think in terms of those kinds of properties, or in terms of a general property, from like God is than which nothing greater can be taught. So from this definition, you derive all those properties, all omni properties. So my question is I'm finished. Two questions, in fact, two-part questions. First of all, if I'm right in interpreting your talk as containing the claim that Candomblé is a monotheistic tradition, so what grounds you have for supporting this claim? And the second one, which I think is more important, how would you justify to use the word supreme to characterize, to describe that being and the sense in which you are using the word supreme?
Great. These are great questions, Ricardo, and I feel that I need to clarify a few points. No, I am not saying that Candomblé is monotheistic, at least if we think of monotheism in the kind of in the kind of framework that, for example, those Africanist scholars that said Olodumare is God with capital G. That's not the claim I'm making at all. I'm saying the myths tell us against that. But if I were forced to choose between monotheism and polytheism, I try to go in between and actually use a phrase that was used, I think, by Bolaji Ido, and say we have something like a diffused monotheism. There's no monotheism in the sense that we have a capital G God here, and at the same time, it's not like we have just a bunch of gods and no one above, right? Olodumare is supreme, to address the second point you raised, in the sense, not in the sense that he's an omni-god, that he's supremely knowledgeable, benevolent, and powerful. At least he's supremely powerful, because he's the source of all power and the source of all life. So everything that exists because of Olodumare, and Olodumare is actually the one who confers life and who confers power to the Orishas and then to human beings. So in that sense, at least, he's supreme. We could nitpick on the meaning of supreme, but I'm not saying supreme in the sense of omni-God, but at the same time, I'm not saying with the view number 3, for example, Segun Badejeshin, who says that Olodumare is not even supreme. He's on the same tier as those other 3 high deities, which are Obatala Oshala, the one who creates the world, Eshu, who's here, by the way, the messenger and the deity of order and balance, and Orunmila, who's the deity of wisdom and divination. But the Egyptian says Olodumare and these 3, they are at the same level. But that doesn't make any sense, because these 3 emerge or are created by Olodumare. So there's at least that sense in which Olodumare is still supreme, but not supreme in the sense of a monotheism that entails perfect being theology, for example, or a theistic personalism, or the omni-God thesis, or whatever you want to call it. Is that clearer?
That helps. Thanks.
But I'll definitely forward you the paper when it's ready, because I think you'll have some more clarifying points to make. Thank you.
Yeah. If after seats, I mean, if we have time, if we do have time, I have one more question related to your answer.
I do.
Go ahead.
I had 2 quick points, 2 quick questions. The first is still like, and the issue that Ricardo was talking with you about this distinction between this deity from Candomblé and the deities from those other, let's say Christian traditions, for example, in terms of the perfect being theology. Now, one thing that you said though is that you at least think that this deity is at least benevolent, but that's the main point that the defenders of the problem of evil are addressing, right? I mean, if that being is good, then there is some sort of contradiction with the word that this being created, because he's powerful. He has a lot of power, and it's good. Now, the same question is coming over again. I mean, by saying that he's benevolent, do you think that he's good? And in which sense he's good? I mean, he's good in terms of being against evil, in terms of being against of any sort of kind of bad things. Now, and the other question is kind of unrelated, but it's still like a curious question from a analytical philosophy perspective, because you said that, I mean, how can we do, especially analytic philosophy, that is centered, is focused so much on precision, right? Of a non-textual tradition. I mean, because the idea of analytic philosophy is transparency, precision, right? So it's hard, but you can, of course, reply to me and say, I mean, it's still hard for those traditions because, you know, you have different texts, different versions of the same text. So precision is also a problem. But again, we still have the text. So how can you do analytic philosophy looking for precision when you don't have a text by looking who that person is saying, what that person is saying, what does that person is saying, if you don't have that to look for precision? Go ahead, please.
Okay, so, 2 points. First point, regarding goodness, the myths don't even tell us that Olodumare is good, let alone all good. I've never seen that attribute being a quality of the Supreme Being in Candomblé. Apparently, he does things that we think are bad. For example, breathing life into misshapen forms. You can think of the most horrible birth defects, spina bifida, for example. Why would God, with a lot of scare quotes here, why would Olodumare breathe life into these forms? He could have just said to Oshala, try again when you're sober. Just try again. Or he could have corrected the mistakes, but he doesn't. So he may be just in a few narratives, for example. That's an attribute, but good. I think that these categories are maybe not very relevant to talking about Olodumare, and this is an important fact in itself. With regards to analytic philosophy in general and analytic philosophy of religion, I don't even think that's what I'm trying to do. I'm not very attached to the category of analytic philosophy at all. By this time, I know I come from that tradition because that's what I've been taught, but I think I'm getting more Wittgensteinian by the minute as I go as I get older. So I'm trying to do something like Mick Burley and D.Z. Phillips and maybe the second Wittgenstein have defended, which is trying to do conceptual justice to forms of life, religious forms of life, which have not been done conceptual justice towards. So these forms of life have been studied by anthropologists and ethnographers for a long time. We have at least 100 years of anthropology of the Afro-Brazilian religions. In those 100 years, Not a single philosopher in Brazil even has picked up these books and said, maybe let's just do some philosophy from these sources. So that's what I'm trying to do. That's all I'm trying to do. If I'm being super precise or not, I'm trying to do something with sources that are not very orthodox in the philosophical sense. They are not, the texts are from oral traditions, and we don't have a systematic theology to work from. So, but at the same time, I'm trying to do some kind of conceptual justice in the sense that I'm not overgeneralizing for the sake of being precise, right? Because these traditions, first of all, these traditions are a plethora of traditions. They don't have a regulating body. So every worship place in Candomblé, and by saying Candomblé, I'm saying something that actually refers to a lot of traditions. So in these terreiros, in these worship places, the father or mother of that worship place is the Pope, is the last word. So we have a lot of different opinions. And if I try to be very precise, I'm gonna end up pissing off a lot of people. So I think it's better to just be upfront about this and say, well, this is a very confusing plethora of traditions, and they have these things in common, and these things are not. So I'm just trying to weed out the very absurd, which for me, for example, would be the idea that Olodumare is God with capital G, the God of the philosophers and theologians, the Abrahamic God dressed in African garb. That's not the case at all. So if we can weed out at least these absurd positions, I will be very happy having done my work. And maybe in the future, we will have more philosophers working on this to the point that we can even maybe figure out how to do systematic theology from these sources. But I doubt very much that we'll do, because mainly the practitioners of Candomblé are not very interested in systematic theology. If we try to do this, they will look at us and say, why are you doing this? We don't need this. This is something you need from your, as I think Evan Fails said, from the very Protestant background of trying to say religion is text-based. Oh no, it was Adam, actually. So I think that's the gist of it. I hope I've made my point. Thanks very much, Francisco.
Wonderful, thank you.
Good. Thank you. Was an answer. So I don't have any more questions. Someone else wants to ask a final question? Happy? Wonderful. So thank you very much, Eduardo, for being here. Thank you very much. It was, I mean, this is really needed. I completely agree with you. I mean, and many people, they have this opinion now that we have to do philosophy in terms of all the religions, which so far have been underrepresented, right? So it's wonderful that you are doing that.
The main thing, if I can say one last thing, the main thing here, the main problem, I guess, is that we cannot stand on the shoulders of giants while doing this kind of philosophical exercise. We need to maybe come up with new methodology. So it's very meta philosophical work, and I invite everyone who's listening in, and maybe this will be recorded and posted online. So if people are excited about doing philosophy of religion from different neglected sources, the first challenge will be methodological. Like, how do I do this, and from what sources? And I guess you'll find out and agree with me eventually that if you're dealing with traditions that are not text-based and do not possess a systematic theology, you will need to engage very much with ethnography and cultural anthropology, which for me is great news, because these are very interesting things, and there are so many religious traditions that have not been the subject of philosophical investigation at all. So it's a whole emerging and huge field of study that could, I think will bloom and blossom in the coming years.
Yes, definitely. Wonderful. So I also thank you all that came, that attended our meeting, that asked questions. Thank you very much. And that's it. Our next webinar would be November 16. It would be delivered by Aaron Cortland. And the title is Logical, Metaphysical, and Theological Possibility. The chair will be my friend Daniel Molto. So we hope to see you again in about 1 month from now. So have a nice day. Thank you very much, everyone.